a pleasure, to have all of you join us today for a webinar about a topic that is obviously at the core of ME/CFS and now long COVID, and that's really the effect on sleep. So we're delighted to have with us today Dr. Elie Gottlieb, who's a neuroscientist that has been studying sleep, circadian rhythm, and the effects of those on well-being, both in a clinical setting as well as in the academic and industry. So really thought that bringing this perspective today is going to be helpful to learn from this experience, and also because at SleepScore Labs, the approach is to really have a product that is based on science and empowers people to take greater ownership of managing their lives. So we thought that these are important things to bring to our community. We're delighted to have with us not only Dr. Gottlieb today, but also Benjamin Ho. Next slide, please. Benjamin is a new member of our Lived Experience Task Force, and Benjamin, really thank you for joining us today. Benjamin is in his fourth year of undergrad, and he's now taking a pause because of ME/CFS, which he got when he was in upstate New York in college. And really, really appreciate Benjamin that you're joining us today. And willing to share your experience. So we wanted to start the conversation today, Benjamin, if I may, just ask you a few questions, and then we'll have Dr. Gottlieb join us to conduct the conversation and take us through his presentation. But Benjamin, please, if you would like to start by sharing some of the things that really you experience in terms of sleep, and what how do you describe that effect on your life?
I mean, I guess for me, my first experience with sleep difficulties with ME was when I first became ill with mono. Typically, people say that you should be sleeping all the time when you have it, but for me, it was really just a battle every day to fall asleep. And sort of later on, as the illness evolved, it became clear that no matter how much time I was setting aside to sleep and to rest, I wasn't feeling more rested the next day. And in fact, I would wake up multiple times throughout the night, pretty much every day. And it was also difficult, because these symptoms are very nonspecific, of course, just like everything else with ME. So it was hard to have doctors sort of believe it and be able to really treat it other than like giving recommendations for sleep hygiene.
Yeah. And so, I think what we'll hear today are ways to document and then follow those disturbances, which hopefully is a good way to then share with a healthcare provider. Dr. Gottlieb, I'd like to invite you for the conversation. If you'd like to also maybe ask Benjamin some questions before we get started.
Yeah, Benjamin, I think it's important for people to hear what aspects of sleep, might be poor for you. Because, the truth is, as we'll talk about today, sleep is a multifaceted behavior, right? So you can have issues with the quality of your sleep, with falling asleep, staying asleep, and the duration of your sleep. So can you just walk us through sort of, on days where it's bad or nights where it's bad, what are you sort of experiencing?
I guess on nights when it's bad, it almost feels like my body's not letting myself like get into a deep stage of sleep. It feels like it's constantly like being run by adrenaline. So it like I would wake up like at like with really, really small sounds, or that I would have trouble falling asleep unless like my environment around me was like totally dark or quiet. Um, and like not only that, like I would have trouble like falling asleep after waking up or something like that.
Mm. And the effects the next day, obviously for anyone, when you don't sleep well, there's cognitive effects, there's sort of physiological effects. For you, are there certain things that are differentially impacted, like your mood or your reaction time?
I would say my reaction time is definitely impacted the next day. My mood, I have definitely noticed like a much shorter temper after not sleeping well. And just generally ME symptoms seem to be worse in the next day after not sleeping well.
Yeah. And have there been any triggers for you? So have you noticed during the day, if you do one thing, it can sort of mess up your sleep at night? Or, for some people, it could be little things like caffeine. For others, it could be light. What are the main triggers of poor sleep for you, if you've even been able to identify them?
I think caffeine is definitely a big one for me. And like light, using devices before bed, or
Mm.
like in bed, which is difficult during a crash, of course, when you can't really get out of bed. Trying to find ways to like pass the time is, and like stay in touch with others is difficult, of course.
Mm. Yeah. And as we'll talk about today, it's sleep is impacted by a range of factors, from light, from sound, environmental factors. So for every one individual factor that's affected, there might be a solution, but at the same time, there's a lot of factors that are impacting sleep. So it's a very difficult thing to handle. So how long has it been since you've been experiencing, these sleep issues, and what's your goal when it comes to improving sleep?
It's been about 4 years this month. And in terms of goals, I would say more consistent restful sleep, and trying to regularize, I guess, my circadian rhythm so I don't like flip between like two different modes depending on my symptoms.
Yeah. And that's one thing we'll talk about today. Is people think a lot about sleep as, sort of this binary thing, either you're sleeping or you're not. But there's this other side of the coin, which is the circadian rhythm. And it's a bit less explored. It's sort of like an enigma in the sleep space. There are sleep scientists and circadian scientists, and very few times are they looking at what each other are doing. So I think it is really important that we highlight some of the circadian differences that we're seeing in SEFS patients as well, and really try to think of what are some interventions or solutions or options for people who have sort of inconsistency when it comes to their sleep-wake patterns, and their circadian potentially abnormalities. So that's going to be a key part of the talk as well, because I don't think the circadian rhythm gets enough attention. So first of all, thank you so much for sharing your story. But is there anything else that you wanted to ask, or otherwise?
No, let's get started with the presentation. I think Benjamin will stay with us, and we'll take more questions after your presentation.
Fantastic. Let me just share my screen. Give me 1 second. All right. Can you see my screen?
Yes, please go ahead.
Perfect. So before we start, I just want to highlight the complexity of some of the topics we're going to cover today. The truth is, this is really a developing area. And in fact, most of the research on sleep and circadian rhythms has been in ME CFS just because it's been around longer. Every week there's new research coming up around the effects of long COVID on a range of outcomes, but the data is really still in its infancy. So today there will be a few times where I highlight some very recent data on long COVID, but the majority of the work will showcase the effects of sleep on ME/CFS. Whether or not the results are similar for each condition is unclear. It's possible. So I just want to highlight that. And one last caveat is, I want to focus the talk on the question of why, right? Why are people suffering from poor and unrefreshing sleep? What is really happening in the brain of someone with this condition that might be contributing to unrefreshing or poor quality sleep? And as you can imagine, the answer is complicated and it's multifaceted. So I will do my best to simplify some of the key messages, but the truth is, if it was easy, we would have figured it out years ago. So the quest is still very much on. Now, I just want to start by highlighting this beautiful thing, which is sleep. There is the bright side of sleep, and as many of you have experienced, the dark side of sleep. The dark side of sleep is clear, right? Sleep deprivation impacts every physiological function in the body. And, one aspect that especially buckles under the pressure of sleep deprivation is cognition, as Benjamin mentioned. So reaction time, motor function, complex executive processing, mood and stamina, right? These are just a few aspects of our behavior that are particularly sensitive to sleep loss. And the truth is, sleep loss can be devastating and it could be deadly. So over 100,000 car crashes a year are caused by drowsy drivers, and that number is likely conservative. And public health disasters and accidents like the Chernobyl disaster, Exxon's oil spill, and the Challenger explosion have been linked to sleep-related fatigue and human error. And it costs us a lot of money. So a recent RAND study found that lack of sleep costs the US economy about $411 billion a year. Now, that's the dark side. And there is a bright side. Although most research has really looked at the effects of sleep deprivation on human health, there's been a surge of data over the past few years alone showing that sleep extension can really improve human health. And unfortunately, we know that this can be difficult for individuals with ME, CFS, and long COVID. These people are, you're differentially affected by poor and unrefreshing sleep. But what is the actual prevalence of poor sleep? And why are you experiencing poor sleep? And before we go into it, I just want to lay some ground rules for how I'm going to be talking about sleep. I want to discuss sleep stages because it turns out that it's not just the quantity of sleep, but it's the quality and the distribution of these various sleep stages during a 7 to 8 hour period that might be associated with poor sleep and may be key for unlocking refreshing sleep. So sleep is remarkably dynamic, and it is an incredibly active process in the brain. When we're sleeping, there are generally two types of sleep that we experience throughout the night. The first is called non-rapid eye movement sleep, or non-REM sleep for short. Now, within REM, there are three stages of sleep. Sleep scientists, by the way, are not very creative, so we've dubbed them non-REM 1, non-REM 2, and non-REM 3. And the majority of the talk today is going to focus on non-REM 3, which we also call deep sleep or slow wave sleep. During this stage of sleep, the brain is going through these high amplitude and very low frequency waves. It's actually beautiful to look at. And what we'll discuss later is that the amplitude and the power of these waves might not be as high in those with ME/CFS. It's also the stage of sleep associated with clearing the brain of toxic waste that's built up throughout the day. It's associated with growth hormone, and it tends to be the stage of sleep that people often associate with restoration. But the truth is every sleep stage is important. In fact, we spend 50 to 60% of the night in non-REM 2 and non-REM 1, which some people have dubbed light sleep. There's also REM sleep. This is rapid eye movement sleep. This is the stage of sleep where dreams are most likely to occur, and it's critical for emotional regulation and even creativity. And now that we've laid some of those ground rules about what kind of sleep we're going to actually be talking about, let's sort of dig into what the research around the prevalence of sleep problems is in ME/CFS and long COVID, and what are the similarities, what are the differences in sleep problems between the two conditions. So let's start with long COVID. And as you can imagine, the prevalence of sleep really ranges depending on when a measurement was taken, the severity of the condition, and of course, the actual sleep problem that was measured. After 16 weeks, one study found that 32% of these 500 patients met the criteria for insomnia. Another study found that 62% of 60 patients met the criteria for obstructive sleep apnea. These are two very common sleep disorders, but appear to be even more common in long COVID patients. But interestingly, to my knowledge, there has not been a study using a validated measure of non-restorative sleep in individuals with long COVID. This is a huge limitation of some of the prior research, and it really highlights that we need more research to understand whether the prevalence of unrefreshing, non-restorative sleep is comparable between long COVID patients and ME/CFS patients. In ME/CFS patients, authors have noted that the sleep problems that you're experiencing are absolutely distinct from those of primary sleep disorders. There are, of course, what we call comorbidities. People who have ME/CFS are also at higher risk for several sleep disorders like obstructive sleep apnea, narcolepsy, and insomnia. And the prevalence of non-restorative sleep, which should be a key diagnostic criteria, is really between 55, 87, up towards to 100%, depending on the study that you're looking at. It is incredibly prevalent. And what we're finding is that sleep problems are likely bidirectionally associated with ME/CFS and long COVID. There's a cyclical problem here, right? Where poor quality or insufficient sleep can contribute to things like reduced pain thresholds, impaired cognition, irritability, and performance. And this can cause, of course, negative emotions and thoughts and behaviors. And as you can imagine, pre-sleep, this is what we call hyperarousal. So this is really increased alertness and anxiety, elevated heart rate, and respiration. And as you can probably imagine, this is not a recipe for success when it comes to sleep. I always say that stress and anxiety are sleep's worst nightmare. So why? Why is this even happening in the first place? And as you can imagine, it is incredibly complicated. And we actually don't have a single answer, but there are, of course, several potential neurological explanations. This slide is a lot, I recognize that, but if there's one sort of overview slide, this is really it. There are several neurological differences that have really been described in those with ME/CFS compared to healthy controls. And since it's a multi-system illness characterized by, a diverse range of debilitating symptoms, there are obviously multiple potential neurological causes of poor sleep. There was a recent 2020 systematic review that found that several studies reported a few things: reduced cerebral blood flow, increased neuroinflammation in brain regions that are, we think, responsible for sleep, increased brain metabolites, and reduced functional connectivity to areas of the brain that are involved in sleep-wake functioning. And on the sleep side of things, there are several studies that showed that individuals with ME/CFS have reduced sleep quality, measured not globally, but when we look at the deep sleep and the power of sleep in someone, these things are reduced. And interesting, there was some work showing that while patients often report subjective sleep quality, right, these subjective complaints are actually correlated with certain brain regions. And there is often a few differences in sleep that was, that were measured more broadly and objectively. And this has really left some researchers to suspect that, individuals with ME/CFS might be misperceiving their sleep quality. In other words, they may be experiencing poor sleep, but that might not be what's actually happening when we look objectively. But actually, this has been refuted in a recent study, which I'll highlight shortly, where not only are we seeing subjective sleep quality complaints, but we're also seeing objective differences in sleep quality when we look really, really closely. Lastly, we're going to look at some work on the circadian rhythm and functioning. As I mentioned earlier, individuals with ME/CFS have impaired circadian functioning. And luckily, there are some really interesting trials that have looked at the effectiveness of things like light for symptom improvement and sleep with some positive effects. Now, let's first look into the data around unrefreshing sleep versus refreshing or quality sleep. As I mentioned earlier, the prevalence of unrefreshing sleep is extremely high. Upwards of 100% of ME/CFS patients report unrefreshing sleep, depending on the study. But the cause is unclear, right? Several studies did not identify objective sleep differences. But when they did look at objective sleep differences, they looked at objective sleep more globally. In other words, do ME/CFS patients versus healthy controls spend the same amount of time in slow wave or deep sleep? Point blank, right? And if so, then there must be an issue with misperception, right? But this study refuted that. They looked more deeply at the quality of those slow waves in deep sleep across multiple brain regions. And sure enough, they found that when compared to controls, ME/CFS patients had reduced power of what we call delta activity. And this delta activity in the brain has been associated with refreshing sleep, especially during slow wave sleep. And they also found other more nuanced differences that might, again, potentially refute this idea that pure sleep is purely a subjective phenomena in ME/CFS patients. But what happens when we look at the brain of someone with ME/CFS who is experiencing poor sleep? Are there any markers or correlates there? This study found that ME/CFS patients with unrefreshing sleep have damage to an area of the brain known as the medial prefrontal cortex. And what's really interesting is that another study showed that a reduction in the volume of this area of the brain was associated with a reduction of slow wave sleep activity. So in long COVID patients, we actually see something a little bit similar. We see that damage to certain areas of the brain within the brain stem, this deep part of the brain, which we know is critical for the regulation and the maintenance of sleep, is also damaged. In other words, we are finally seeing neurological biomarkers of poor sleep in both long COVID patients and ME/CFS patients. And this is just another added body of literature that, again, refutes this suggestion that unrefreshing sleep is simply a misperception and there are no objective correlates. I promise this is the last brain picture, but another study has shown a similar pattern where areas of the brain that are responsible for sleep-wake functioning have some kind of impaired neurological function. In this case, several studies have shown that ME/CFS patients have shown lower overall cerebral blood flow, and others also shown that the cortical regions and cerebellar regions, which are critical in sleep-wake regulation, have lower blood flow as well. So again, these are just potential markers of not only poor sleep, but also might be risk factors for cognition or poor cognition. Now, the next few slides I think are especially critical because our circadian rhythm helps set when we're energetic, when we're active, when we're alert, when we're in a good or a bad mood. And what we're finding is that this circadian rhythm, this sort of internal biological clock of ours, is really disrupted in ME/CFS patients compared with healthy controls. And the good news is that there are several external environmental cues that can influence our circadian rhythm and sort of nudge it in the right direction. And we call these environmental cues Zeitgebers. And what researchers have found is that individuals with ME/CFS show irregular activity patterns with a reduction in total activity, lower activity rhythm amplitude, so the actual magnitude of the activity is lower, and also less stable rhythms, which has suggested that fatigue and inactivity in the context of ME/CFS may be both a cause and an effect of circadian rhythm disruption. And luckily, this data also gives us an objective overview of when individuals with ME/CFS are most likely to peak in terms of their overall activity during the day. And these data suggest that activity in individuals with ME/CFS peaks around 12 to 2 p.m. And therefore, scheduling perhaps graded exercise therapy during this time can have a beneficial impact on things like fatigue and mood, cognition, but especially sleep. In fact, this is a very key point and takeaway I want to emphasize. Exercise is one of the only behavioral interventions that naturally increases the quantity and the quality of deep sleep and slow wave sleep throughout the night. Now, with that said, I fully grasp that graded exercise for some people can worsen symptoms, especially post-exertional malaise, and its role in treating the condition is controversial. But the data around its effects on sleep, exercise and sleep, especially slow wave sleep, which other studies showed was impaired in this population, is quite clear. And I mentioned that there are other sort of environmental cues that influence the circadian rhythm. Light is the strongest, or among the strongest, environmental cues that signals to our body when we should be awake, when we should be alert, and when we should be asleep. And you've probably heard a lot of people say that, oh, blue light in particular is bad for you. But when it comes to any kind of light, it's the timing that is really critical. Blue light, and especially broad spectrum sunlight in the morning or early afternoon, can improve our mood, our productivity, and it also helps set the circadian rhythm. And this study found that in ME/CFS patients, they were exposed to lower light intensity during the day than healthy controls. So even getting more light during the day can sort of hopefully move the needle in the right direction when it comes not just to our sleep, but also our circadian rhythm. And other studies have actually found that bright light therapy can improve pain sensitivity in some groups. In this study, they found it improved pain sensitivity in fibromyalgia patients. And in a study that looked at the effects of melatonin or light therapy on ME/CFS symptoms, neither of them improved the symptoms, but highlighted here in yellow, light therapy did reduce the amount of self-reported sleep disturbances after the effects of phototherapy or light therapy. Now, I think it's important to note that the light therapy that was used in this study was significantly lower than what's typically been used. So you could maybe argue that more liberal light therapy might have moved that needle. And that's something you might want to consider speaking about your doctor. So before I end the talk, I just want to give you 5 more really evidence-based tips to improve your sleep. The first one is the basic, right? But it's been sort of this gold standard and basic one for a while, because for some people it works, right? For those not suffering from a sleep disorder, basic sleep hygiene might be an effective first plan of attack. Now, before I go into this, I do want to emphasize, for those not suffering from a sleep disorder, I want to highlight the importance of screening and getting a potential diagnosis for an undiagnosed sleep disorder, up to 90% of cases of sleep apnea, for example, go completely undiagnosed and therefore untreated. And we know that there are a ton of comorbidities between various conditions and sleep apnea. So I highly encourage you, if you or your partner suspect that you might have a sleep disorder, reach out to your general practitioner, ask for a formal sleep study to rule out any sleep disorders. And when it comes to sleep hygiene, consistency is key, right? Going to bed and waking up at the same time every single day is key for not just supporting our circadian rhythm, but also those sleep stages. Remember earlier when I said that exercise is one of the only things that can actually improve the quantity and the quality of our deep sleep? Well, consistency is one as well. Going to bed and waking up at the same time every single day, even on weekends, is really helpful. Cut the caffeine after 2 p.m. So, some populations are even more sensitive to caffeine, but for the general population, we know that it takes the body anywhere from 8 to 12 hours to fully metabolize caffeine. Reverse engineer that timing and see when, if you are drinking caffeine to support your condition, what would be the latest cutoff time for you. And some people use alcohol to help them fall asleep. Alcohol is one of the most potent REM sleep suppressors. In other words, it can help you fall asleep initially, but then it drastically disturbs the quality of your sleep throughout the night. Think dark or dim before bed. So as I mentioned earlier, we tend to demonize blue light, but blue light in the morning and in the early afternoon it can be helpful for setting our circadian rhythm, improving our productivity, mood, and focus. But you don't want to trick your brain at night into thinking it's daytime. So within 3 to 4 hours before bedtime, start to dim the lights, right? Try to mirror the sunset. Once the sun starts to dim and set, start to dim your lights at home. As I mentioned earlier, view bright light, ideally sunlight, in the morning for the first 15 to 30 minutes if possible. That might help support your circadian rhythm. Positive psychology. So Charlotte Bront once said that a ruffled mind makes a restless pillow. So how can we sort of unruffle the mind before we drift off? So mindfulness meditation is one positive psychology solution you might want to incorporate into your pre-sleep routine. It really refers to the ability to be fully present and aware of where you are and what you're doing. And in fact, several research studies, randomized control trials, have found that guided mindfulness meditation can actually improve sleep quality and even daytime impairments in older adults. Gratitude is another sort of quintessential positive psychology solution that involves sort of an overall positive orientation toward the world, right? And some preliminary data supports the use of gratitude before bed. And it actually has been shown to have a positive effect on the overall sleep quality. And to make it a part of your pre-sleep routine, you can jot down a few things before bed. You can take a few minutes to tell someone how much you appreciate them, even write a full-fledged letter, right? I always say that your sleep will thank you for practicing gratitude. A sleep oasis. So create a sleep oasis, right? Your bedroom is really where the magic happens. So in patients with full-fledged insomnia, we use something called stimulus control, which means we really try to only use the bed for sleep, sickness, and sex. So whenever you think about your bedroom, you can, if you're laying in bed for an hour, 2 hours, unable to fall asleep, my recommendation is actually, even after 30 minutes, get out of bed if you can't fall asleep. Go do something relaxing. That way you don't start to train your brain to associate your bed with being awake rather than sleep. Think like a bat, keep it cool, dark, and quiet. Temperature regulation is one thing that might also be disturbed in some patients. So remember to keep your bedroom comfortably cool. So for some people, that could be 68 degrees. For others, it could be 61. I like it especially cool. I'm crazy. I like to sleep at like 65, but whatever is comfortably cool. And one way to reduce your core body temperature is actually to take a warm bath before bed. So studies have shown that when you take a warm bath before bed, or even potentially a hot shower, this expels heat from the body and it cools your core body temperature. And your core body temperature needs to be reduced by between 1 to 2 degrees Fahrenheit in order for sleep to be initiated. As I mentioned earlier, take control of your circadian rhythm. Our brain synchronizes to sunlight viewing and exercise and eating, and the timing of these behaviors, being consistent with them, can improve our overall circadian functioning and also our attention and our alertness. And the last one is harness the power of technology. So on the right is actually a friend of mine who was my test subject when I was learning how to set up an in-lab sleep study. We call this polysomnography. If you were ever to get diagnosed for a formal sleep disorder, you might be undergoing this. You can see it's a lot of wires and it's slightly invasive, but it has been the gold standard for measuring sleep and diagnosing sleep disorders since the 1960s. And while consumer sleep technologies haven't fully replaced these devices, they can help the average person become more aware of their sleep patterns and related behaviors that are influencing their sleep. And these technologies can really provide us with data that really 15 years ago was totally confined to a doctor's office. They're now becoming a lifestyle product, really giving us a lens into our own health. And if you're looking to measure your sleep in the most non-invasive way possible and really go beyond sleep tracking, then I want to just discuss our SleepScore technology and what's sort of different about it and why it's a really fantastic piece of tech. So this is the SleepScore app. It is a free to download app. It doesn't require any specialist hardware. You don't have to pay $300 for a ring. And what it does is it essentially turns your smartphone into an active sonar device. It'll send inaudible sound waves to the upper body, and it allows us to measure your breathing and your gross body motion without touching the body. So it just sits by your bedside, and it, again, sends those inaudible sound waves. You can't hear them. And from that, we can measure sleep in an incredibly accurate way without ever touching the body. In fact, it's the only widely available mobile sleep app with publications showing its performance against that gold standard PSG, polysomnography, that I showed you in the slide before, showing an overall accuracy of 85+%, which is nearly double the accuracy of some other devices. And the great thing about the technology is that it really goes beyond sleep tracking. The sort of, so what, I slept 6 hours last night, what can I actually do about it? So the data that we collect and some of the daytime behavior that we collect are used in what we call our advice engine. And it really provides dynamic and personalized behavioral sleep advice that is founded on the principles of sleep hygiene and cognitive behavioral change techniques. But we know that in order for our advice and our recommendations to be useful, the data feeding into that needs to be accurate. And that's why we take pride in the accuracy of our technology as well. Here's just an overview of some of the tools that really deliver this personalized and actionable and impactful sleep improvement experience, from sleep tracking to your sleep history. You could see some of the deep sleep insights that I mentioned earlier. Our app can collect that as well for you. So if you're interested in tracking the amount of time that you spend in deep sleep, the app can do that as well. Then we offer sleep coaching and content and sleep solutions. So instead of seeing just a laundry list of 10 sleep hygiene recommendations, we personalize those recommendations based on your sleep. So if you're looking to just improve your overall sleep health and your sleep habits and sleep behaviors, a tool like the SleepScore app can really help push you in the right direction and make you more aware of what's actually going on with your sleep throughout the night. I'm happy to open it up for Q&A now. And I wanted to say thank you so much for taking the time to listen to me. I know there was a lot of information there, so I'm happy to answer any questions now.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Gottlieb. This was a great presentation. I'm going to start with a few questions that came during your presentation. I'll just start with a quick technical question. You showed some brain images. What was the methodology that was used? Was those MRI studies? You're on mute.
Sorry. Yes, those were MRI studies, and I'll share the I'll share the complete. So some of the actual references are included in the slides, and I'm happy to share the full references later, and you could check out some of the actual methodology yourself as well. These are peer-reviewed studies, and some of them, the MRI studies, some of the MRI methodologies were slightly outdated. So it really highlights the need for more research to look at these more white matter tract specific differences in patients using more innovative MRI technology that's now available.
That's very helpful. So I'm going to turn on to some of the questions that that came in. Start with a question from Chloe. Thank you for sharing this question. And Chloe is a person who's living with long COVID. And they describe their improvement in slowly beginning to exercise, but it seems like exercise actually exacerbates the restless nights. So the non-refreshing sleep happens particularly when they exercise late in the day, afternoon, or evening. So the question is, what could be the underlying mechanism? And really, obviously, they don't want to not exercise, but is there a way to make some changes so that it doesn't affect the non-refreshing sleep? Is there some kind of a hormonal imbalance? What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think the timing of exercise is really important as well. There have been some studies showing that it actually doesn't matter what time you exercise, but this is in a different generally healthy population. In this population, I suspect that the timing of exercise will be really critical, and that's why that study showing that activity generally peaks between 12 to 2 p.m. For some people, that might be an ideal time to take part in activity, in exercise, I should say. But I do think, you need to take a personalized approach to this. What works for some people won't work for others. And just because something improves deep sleep doesn't mean that you should necessarily do it. So, for example, there are some over-the-counter medications like diphenhydramine, antihistamines that might improve the duration of time spent in deep sleep, but it can impact the rest of sleep architecture. In other words, there are some things that can improve one part of sleep but disturb the rest of it. So I do think it's important to take a personalized approach when it comes to exercise, and obviously consult with your doctor on what might be some of those stepping stones to at least start. Obviously, the kind of exercise is important as well. So whether you're doing high intensity interval training versus just treadmill, or jogging, or even just walking around the house, it really depends on what you're able to do.
Yeah, that's so personalization is obviously the key here. Are there any studies about the effectiveness of neurofeedback or hyperbaric chamber on sleep? And are those tools that that could be incorporated into this improvement management that we're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, when we think of neurofeedback, there are some studies that have looked at primarily in more the mindfulness space, getting you to a state of mindfulness through neural feedback. But the feedback from the app can also be useful. And I'm not just, saying that, but when we think of any kind of feedback, we're really trying to say, okay, what is the delta between what I think I'm experiencing versus objective sleep? Or, what are the trends in my sleep based on behaviors that I'm taking part in during the day. So, if you can have something that can quantify that for you, that might be useful. I'm not aware of any hyperbolic chamber research in sleep, or at least consistent effects on sleep. But of course, when it comes to, as I mentioned earlier, mindfulness meditation, things that can reduce arousal pre-sleep might improve the amount of time it takes to fall asleep and might impact the overall architecture of sleep throughout the night as well.
That's very, very, very interesting. I'm going to bring one more question from CJ that asks about restless legs, and I think you mentioned that in one of our earlier conversations, and that is a relatively common symptom. CJ mentions that hot baths are helpful for temporary relief, but is restless leg syndrome something that is distinct, and can it be captured by the app that we talked about?
Yeah, it is among the general population, there's a prevalence of between 3 to 5%, and we do see that in ME/CFS and long COVID as well, there is a higher risk of restless leg syndrome as well, and typically to treat restless leg syndrome, there might be a pharmacological approach to specifically using dopaminergic drugs to improve the symptoms of restless leg syndrome. But there are other more behavioral solutions as well for some people, again, reducing that pre-sleep arousal, whether that is through mindfulness meditation or relaxation techniques, deep breathing, that for some people are effective. The app does not necessarily measure restless leg syndrome. However, in the app, we do have screeners for restless leg syndrome. So if you suspect that you might have restless leg syndrome, insomnia, or obstructive sleep apnea, there are clinically validated screeners in the app that can let you know whether or not you're at a moderate to high risk of the condition, and then a pathway to get treated for it.
Great, thank you. So I want to just pause for a moment and Benjamin, invite you to join the conversation. Any questions or thoughts after hearing the presentation?
Yeah, I just thought that it has really validated a lot of my experiences, and seeing like sort of objective evidence that ME and long COVID really affect sleep from a very physiological level.
Yeah,
I'm glad to hear that again, because there has been research showing this discrepancy between this experience, right, versus objectively measured sleep. But the truth is that we probably weren't looking hard enough. We weren't looking in the right direction. And the way to really understand the objective differences is to not just look globally at overall duration spent in these sleep stages, but it's the quality of those individual sleep stages where we're seeing these differences. And then that allows us to really focus on interventions, right? So if we know it's this delta power, which is associated with refreshing sleep, and it's reduced, there are certain interventions that can support that kind of EEG activity in the brain. So I really hope that now that we're seeing these objective correlates over the next 5, 10, 15 years, hopefully sooner, we can really now develop more targeted interventions that are really trying to increase the amount of deep sleep, given what we know about the population. And someone asked, the name of the app is called SleepScore.
That sounds right. Dr. I'm going to combine a few questions. There are quite a few questions about light therapy that you mentioned, and also in ME/CFS, it's also very common to have light sensitivity. So there are some questions about, can you still use light therapy even if you are experiencing light sensitivity due to ME/CFS? How would that work?
Yeah, it's a good question, and to be totally frank, I think it's one that needs to be discussed with the doctor around the intensity and the duration of the light. You don't want something to be uncomfortable. It's really a matter of trying to find something that will support your circadian rhythm. And light is one of those what we call Zeitgebers. It's these environmental cues that set the circadian rhythm. For some people, just getting outside for 15, 20 to 30 minutes is sufficient. For others who either live in an area where there's not a lot of sunlight, or they are not able to go outside as much, then light therapy can be an effective solution. So, I would work with your doctor on the strength, right, the lux of that light, and then see if that helps. But for most people, broad spectrum sunlight can be sufficient.
And that would be also helping in kind of moving or correcting, so to speak, the circadian rhythm, if that's something that happens, right?
Correct. And on the other hand, as I mentioned earlier, we tend to demonize blue light, but you should try to limit the amount of blue light before bed. So try to follow the sunset and sunrise as an example. After sunset, start to dim those lights. You might even want to invest in some blue light blocking lenses. We know that excessive blue light exposure before bed can do a few things. Number one, it can make you cognitively more aroused, right? There's more arousal that happens when we're exposed to bright blue light. And it could also suppress the release of melatonin, which is a hormone that is responsible for the circadian rhythm and sleep-wake regulation.
Yeah. You mentioned in the app that there's a way to share data with a healthcare provider. Could you say a little bit more about that, and how can people really use that to, first of all, validate their experiences, and what would be the kind of data that would be helpful to share with healthcare provider?
Absolutely. So right now, what's happening with a lot of sleep physicians and physicians in general is they'll any person will come in and give them their Fitbit and say, hey, can you just look at this data for me and help me figure this out? And a lot of doctors are sort of overwhelmed. To sort of combat this, what we've done is we've created what's called a doctor's report, where it basically synthesizes all of your objective sleep data from the past 2 weeks and automatically puts it into a report that is easily readable and comprehensive for your doctor. So that way they're not having to go on your phone or your Fitbit and scroll through your data. It puts everything into one document. It highlights all the objective sleep differences. That way you could say to your doctor, hey, look, this is what I've been experiencing over the past few weeks. Things haven't felt right. Can you look at the percentage of time I spent in my deep sleep, my overall total sleep time, the amount of time it takes to fall asleep, my sleep efficiency, my wake after sleep onset, right? All these variables that are different components of sleep health, but are really important overall.
Yeah, that sounds right. And you mentioned cooling in part of your presentation. So there are some questions about that. And is that one of those things that apparently there are some techniques to do that? Do you find that really lowering the temperature is something that can really change those sleep patterns?
It can, and again, I always say what's comfortably cool. Like, some people say that the ideal sleep temperature is between 65 and 68 degrees Fahrenheit, but really you need the bedroom environment needs to be comfortably cool. But your actual extremities, so your hands and your feet, need to be comfortably warm. You also need to reduce the amount of humidity in the room. We know that excessive humidity in the bedroom can cause, sleep-wake dysfunction during the night. So there are several, cooling techniques. Some of them are sort of counterintuitive, as I mentioned. The first one is taking a warm bath or a warm shower before bed within an hour to 2 hours before bed. That's been shown to, again, cool your core body temperature by a couple degrees. And it really is that 1 to 2 degrees is necessary for your body to enter or transition into sleep. And it might not sound like a lot, but if you were to go 1 or 2 degrees in the other direction, that would be like a mild grade fever. So any way to improve and to, sort of reduce your core body temperature can be helpful. There are some other technologies out there like cooling mattresses that can be useful for some people as well, that are a bit more active and personalized. Finding what's right for you, again, whatever is comfortably cool for you is what's best.
Great. Well, there are a lot more questions which I will share with you after the presentation, but I wanted to stop here because we're coming to the top of the hour, and really thank Benjamin. First of all, thank you for sharing your story. There are a lot of supportive comments and appreciation of you willing to share that with us. And to Dr. Gottlieb, thank you for a wonderful presentation. If you could just remind us once more, there's some questions about what is the name of the app and can it be downloaded on both Android and the Apple platforms?
Yes, so the name of the app is called the SleepScore app. It's free to download in these stores. All iOS devices are you can download it on all iOS devices, and you can also download it on most Android devices as well.
Great. Well, thank you very much. And Carmen, if I may ask you to share the final slides, which also will enable people who are part of the webinar today to get free access to more of the app functions. Carmen, please.
Sure. Nani, if you wouldn't mind displaying those. There is a giveaway associated with the webinar today. We're going to select 100 attendees randomly, and you'll receive a code for a free 3-month premium subscription. And everyone else who's registered will receive a code for a 2-month premium subscription. And the folks at SleepScore are going to be fulfilling that giveaway for us. And Ani, if you wouldn't mind advancing one more, just wanted to let you know that your support enables us to put together these free webinars. And if you'd like to help make more of them possible, please consider giving a donation to Solve ME. And also would invite you to follow us on our socials. And once again, I'll let you know that this recording will be available on YouTube in the days to come. So thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you very much.